And after looking at Napoleon's plan to invade Russia, it might not say, "Bring more food." It might say something far more dangerous: "Your strategy only works if your enemy cooperates." Because the real question in 1812 was not whether Napoleon could reach Moscow. The real question was, what was Moscow supposed to do? If the Russian army survived, if Tsar Alexander refused to negotiate, if Napoleon's army was trapped deep inside Russia, then Moscow was not a victory, it was a liability. So could AI save Napoleon's doomed invasion of Russia? The answer is complicated. AI might have saved Napoleon's army, but it probably could not save Napoleon's empire from the ideas that drove it into Russia in the first place. Napoleon did not invade Russia simply because he wanted more land. By 1812, he already dominated much of continental Europe. He had defeated Austria, he had crushed Prussia, he had built a French-led imperial system that stretched across the continent. But Britain remained undefeated. Britain could not easily be invaded because Britain was protected by the sea. So Napoleon tried to defeat Britain economically. This was the continental system. The idea was simple: close European markets to British goods, cut Britain off from continental trade, make Britain suffer without having to cross the English Channel. On paper, it was a brilliant strategy. In reality, it was almost impossible to enforce. European merchants still wanted British goods, ports wanted customs revenue, consumers wanted products, states needed trade, smugglers found routes. Neutral ships carried cargo that was not really neutral, and Russia had its own reasons to resist. Russian nobles needed exports, Russian merchants needed markets, the Russian state needed revenue. The Russian economy could not easily accept being cut off from British trade simply because Napoleon wanted it. So when Russia began moving away from strict enforcement of the blockade, Napoleon saw more than a trade dispute. He saw a challenge to the entire European order he had built. If Russia could defy him and pay no price, then every other power in Europe would notice. Prussia would notice. Austria would notice. Sweden would notice. The German states would notice. The Duchy of Warsaw would notice. Even Napoleon's allies would begin asking, is France still strong enough to enforce obedience? That is why the Russian campaign was not just a military operation, it was a test of imperial credibility. Napoleon wanted to show that the French Empire could still punish defiance. He wanted to force Alexander back into the continental system. But even more than that, he wanted to prove that Europe still had to obey France. This is the first point AI would have examined. Not the roads, not the weather, not the number of wagons, the political goal. What exactly had to happen for the campaign to succeed? Was success the capture of territory? Was it the defeat of Russian armies? Was it the occupation of Moscow? Was it a peace treaty? Was it Russia returning to the blockade? Or was it the restoration of fear across Europe? These are not the same objective, and when a leader confuses them, he can win battles while losing the war. Napoleon's power inside France also depended on more than his own ambition. No ruler governs alone. Even the strongest ruler needs people, institutions, and interests that keep the system running. Napoleon had come to power after the chaos of revolution. He offered order, he protected property, he restored administrative control, he made peace with parts of the Catholic world, he rewarded military service, he gave careers to officials, he created titles, honors, offices, contracts, and opportunities. His empire worked because many groups had reasons to support it. The army supported him because victory meant glory, promotion, pensions, medals, titles, and wealth. The marshals and generals supported him because war made them princes, dukes, governors, and legends. The bureaucracy supported him because his regime created careers, authority, and a powerful central state. The bureaucracy supported him because his regime created careers, authority, and a powerful central state. Financiers and bankers supported stability because the empire needed credit, contracts, and state finance. Manufacturers and merchants hoped that French power would protect markets and direct European trade in their favor. Landowners and property holders supported order because they feared a return to revolutionary chaos. New imperial elites supported him because their status came from Napoleon's system. Allied rulers and foreign elites followed him because he looked unbeatable. These groups did not all want the same thing, but they all benefited from Napoleon's victories. Victory turned war into reward. Victory made the army loyal. Victory made the bureaucracy confident. Victory made financiers trust the state. Victory made allies afraid to defect. Victory made Napoleon seem necessary. But there was a hidden condition. These groups supported the benefits of victory. They did not benefit from catastrophe. They did not benefit from an army destroyed in Russia. They did not benefit from emergency taxes. They did not benefit from endless conscription. They did not benefit from horses, veterans, and officers disappearing in the snow. They did not benefit from allies discovering that Napoleon could be beaten. So AI would have asked a question that is usually missing from simple military analysis. Who gains if this war is short and successful, and who loses if it becomes long, expensive, and inconclusive? A war designed to protect an empire can destroy that empire if it consumes the very army, money, and confidence that hold the system together. This was one of Napoleon's greatest risks. He needed war to maintain imperial credibility, but a failed war could reveal that his credibility was weaker than it looked. Napoleon did not enter Russia without planning. That is another myth. He was not a fool who simply forgot food and marched into winter. He made enormous preparations. He assembled a vast multinational army. He organized supply depots. He planned roads, magazines, transport routes, and rear areas. He understood that Russia was large. He knew that timing mattered. Before the invasion, he even considered that the campaign might stop around Smolensk and Minsk, with Vilnius serving as a winter base. This means Napoleon did not completely ignore winter. He did not completely ignore logistics. He understood that Russia was dangerous, but the problem was not simply planning. The problem was what happened when reality did not follow the plan. Napoleon had a model of war. It had worked before. Move fast, concentrate force, find the enemy army, force a decisive battle, defeat that army, occupy important territory, convert military victory into political submission. This model had made Napoleon the master of Europe. It worked against states that could be broken by the destruction of their main armies. It worked in compact theaters where one campaign could decide the political future. It worked when rulers believed that losing a major army meant they had to negotiate. But Russia was different. Russia was not a small Central European state. Russia had space. It had distance. It had poor roads. It had harsh climate. It had strategic depth. And it had a government that could keep fighting even after losing territory. Napoleon's mistake was not that he failed to understand tactics. His mistake was that he applied the wrong strategic pattern to the wrong kind of enemy. AI would have seen this immediately. It would have asked, why must Russia fight the war Napoleon wants? Why must Russia offer a decisive battle near the frontier? Why must Alexander negotiate if Moscow falls? Why must the loss of territory equal the loss of political will? What if Russia's best strategy is not to defeat Napoleon quickly, but to survive him? That is the key. Russia did not need to win early. Russia needed not to lose decisively. It needed to preserve its army. It needed to trade space for time. It needed to let distance, hunger, roads, disease, and winter become weapons. And that is exactly what made Napoleon's old model dangerous. Every step forward looked like progress, but each step also stretched the army. The farther Napoleon advanced, the more he consumed the conditions that made victory possible. Food disappeared. Fodder disappeared. Horses weakened. Wagons broke. Soldiers fell behind. Supply lines lengthened. Communication slowed. The army became harder to feed, harder to move, and harder to withdraw. Russia could lose land while preserving the war. Napoleon could gain land while losing the campaign. That is the paradox of 1812. Then came Borodino. For Napoleon, Borodino was supposed to be the great battle, the decisive test, the moment when his old method would finally work. The French army fought brutally. The Russians suffered terribly. The road to Moscow was opened. Napoleon could claim victory, but the Russian army was not destroyed. This point is essential. If the Russian main army survived, then Alexander still had choices. If Alexander still had choices, he did not have to negotiate. If he did not have to negotiate, then Moscow could not automatically end the war. Borodino was not Austerlitz. It was not the kind of battle that shattered the enemy state. It was a bloody tactical success that failed to produce the political result Napoleon needed. And from the Russian perspective, the logic was clear. The army had been hurt, but it still existed. The state had lost ground, but it still functioned. The French were now deeper in Russia. Their supply line was longer, their horses were weaker, their army was more exhausted. Time was moving against them. So why should Alexander negotiate? Why should he reward Napoleon for walking into Russia's depth? Why should he surrender when Napoleon's own position was becoming more dangerous every day? This is where AI would have been most valuable, not by calculating a better march schedule, but by asking before Moscow, what if Borodino does not destroy the Russian army? What if the Russians retreat in good enough order to keep fighting? What if the enemy's survival makes your occupation of Moscow politically meaningless? What if your victory only moves you into a worse position? That is the difference between a battlefield result and a strategic result. Napoleon won the road to Moscow, but he did not win the thing Moscow was supposed to deliver: peace. When Napoleon entered Moscow in September 1812, he found a city that could not give him what he needed. Moscow was not the official capital of the Russian Empire. St. Petersburg was. But Moscow was Russia's old capital, a spiritual center, a historical symbol. Napoleon believed its capture would create political shock. He believed it would force Alexander to negotiate. But Moscow was largely abandoned. Then it burned, and Alexander still refused to make peace. This was the decisive moment of the campaign, not because of the fire alone, not because the city was useless as shelter, but because Moscow exposed the failure of Napoleon's political assumption. Napoleon had occupied a symbol. He had not destroyed the Russian army. He had not captured the Tsar. He had not broken the Russian state. He had not destroyed the Russian will to continue. Without negotiation, Moscow was not a political victory. It was a position, a dangerous position, deep inside enemy territory, far from secure supply, occupied by an army that was weakening every day. AI would have issued a clear warning: the campaign objective has failed. The enemy army still exists. The enemy ruler refuses negotiation. The symbolic prize has not produced political leverage. Your army's strength is declining. Your withdrawal window is closing. Do not wait for Moscow to become meaningful. It already failed to become meaningful. This is where Napoleon most needed advice, not about how to stay, but about how to leave. Here Clausewitz becomes useful. Karl von Clausewitz participated in the 1812 campaign on the Russian side. He later became famous for the idea that war is not separate from politics, but a continuation of policy by other means. That idea is exactly what Napoleon's Russian campaign reveals. Military action only matters if it serves the political goal. Marching to Moscow only matters if Moscow creates political pressure. Winning Borodino only matters if it breaks the Russian army or the Russian will. Extending a supply line only matters if the next mile creates more political leverage than military danger. By that standard, Napoleon's campaign failed before the retreat began. It failed when his military progress stopped producing political results. A Clausewitzian AI would not simply ask, "Can the army reach Moscow?" It would ask, "What political effect will reaching Moscow produce? And what will you do if that effect does not happen?" This second question was the question Napoleon never solved. So what should AI have recommended? First, AI should have challenged the political goal. If the goal was to force Russia back into the continental system, AI would ask whether that system was sustainable in the first place. If Europe still needed trade with Britain, if merchants were willing to smuggle, if neutral ships could bypass restrictions, if Russia's economy suffered from strict enforcement, then military pressure could force obedience for a time, but it could not easily make the system permanent. AI would ask, are you fighting to solve a problem, or are you fighting to delay the collapse of a system that cannot hold together? Second, AI should have examined the people and institutions that kept Napoleon's empire running: the army, the marshals, the officials, the financiers, the merchants, the manufacturers, the property owners, the allied elites. They might support a short war that restored fear of France, but would they support a war that destroyed the army? Would they support a campaign that consumed money, horses, men, and confidence without producing peace? Would they support another round of conscription after the best soldiers disappeared in Russia? Would they still believe in Napoleon if Europe saw him retreat? AI would not treat domestic support as an afterthought. It would treat it as part of the battlefield. Because the empire was not held together by maps, it was held together by confidence. Third, AI should have modeled Russia's most rational response, not the response Napoleon wanted, the response that served Russia best. Russia did not need to defeat Napoleon immediately. Russia needed to avoid destruction. It needed to keep the army alive. It needed to refuse a peace that rewarded French overextension. It needed to make the distance between Napoleon and his supply base more dangerous than any Russian attack. AI would warn, the enemy's best move is not to stop you. The enemy's best move is to let you go too far. Fourth, AI should have created hard stopping rules before the campaign began, not after Moscow. If the Russian main army is not destroyed by Smolensk, stop. If Alexander does not negotiate after a major battle, stop. If Moscow is captured but no peace offer appears, leave immediately. If horse losses pass a critical level, stop. If supplies cannot support winter quarters, stop. If the army's survival becomes more important than symbolic victory, stop. If the war begins to damage the empire's internal support more than it strengthens imperial credibility, stop. A good AI advisor would not merely optimize movement, it would define failure before failure became undeniable. And fifth, AI should have warned Napoleon against imperial momentum. That may be the most dangerous force in the campaign. The deeper Napoleon advanced, the harder it became to admit that the advance was wrong. The more he risked, the more he needed the risk to mean something. The more Moscow became the goal, the harder it became to question whether Moscow mattered. This is not just a historical problem, it is a human problem. Leaders often continue bad strategies not because they lack information, but because stopping would force them to admit that the story behind the strategy was wrong. Napoleon needed the story to be true. He needed Russia to bend. He needed Moscow to matter. He needed his old model of war to work again. AI could challenge the story, but it could not force Napoleon to stop believing it. Would Napoleon have listened? That is the final problem. Napoleon was not stupid. He was not incapable of advice. He listened when advice fit his broader plan. He changed tactics. He adapted to circumstances. He calculated constantly. But he was also a ruler whose power depended on victory, movement, pressure, and the belief that his will could shape events. An AI advisor could say, the Russian army is not destroyed. Alexander has no reason to negotiate. Moscow has failed as a political instrument. Your supply line is too long. Your army is declining. Your domestic and allied support will suffer if this becomes a disaster. But would Napoleon accept that? Or would he treat it as excessive caution? Would he say the AI did not understand morale? Would he say boldness changes probabilities? Would he say one more march, one more message, one more week in Moscow might produce peace? That is why AI cannot be treated as magic. AI can identify a bad strategy. It cannot automatically make a powerful leader abandon it. AI can calculate risk. It cannot create humility. AI can show the cost of ambition. It cannot remove ambition. In 1812, the central failure was not that Napoleon lacked information. It was that the information he needed threatened the logic of his empire. So could AI save Napoleon's invasion of Russia? If save means conquering Russia, probably not. Russia was too large. The political goal was too fragile. The continental system was too difficult to enforce. The Russian army survived. Alexander had little reason to negotiate while Napoleon's army was deep inside Russia. and the French Empire depended too much on the appearance of unstoppable power. If save means forcing Europe into permanent obedience, also probably not. Because fear is not permanent. Economic pressure creates resistance. Allies obey while obedience seems safer than defiance, but once defiance succeeds, the system begins to crack. But if save means preventing catastrophe, then yes, AI might have saved the Grande Armée. It might have warned Napoleon not to cross the Niemen under those assumptions. It might have told him to stop at Smolensk. It might have told him to winter near Vilnius. It might have told him to withdraw immediately when Moscow failed to produce peace. It might have told him that a campaign designed to defend the empire had become a machine for destroying the army that made the empire possible. But even then, the final obstacle would remain Napoleon himself. Because the deepest lesson of 1812 is not that Napoleon should have had better maps, it is that a leader can be brilliant and still be trapped by his own model of success. Napoleon had used speed, battle, pressure, and political shock to break enemies before. In Russia, those tools did not disappear, they simply stopped producing the same result. The old formula still moved the army forward, but it no longer moved the war toward victory. AI could have shown him that. It could have warned him that the Russian army's survival made negotiation unlikely. It could have warned him that Moscow was not enough. It could have warned him that the people and institutions supporting his empire benefited from victory, not from imperial self-destruction. It could have warned him that the campaign was no longer serving policy, it was consuming policy. So the final verdict is this: AI could probably save Napoleon from destroying his army, but it could not guarantee that Napoleon would accept the limits of reality. It could expose the false assumptions, it could calculate the risk, it could recommend withdrawal, it could challenge the meaning of Moscow, but it could not force Alexander to surrender. It could not make the continental system sustainable. It could not make Russia small. It could not turn a symbolic occupation into political victory. And it could not make Napoleon stop believing that his empire could bend history to his will. AI might have saved the army, but it could not save the illusion. If you were Napoleon's AI advisor in 1812, what would you recommend? Invade Russia to defend the empire? Stop at Smolensk? March to Moscow and wait for peace? Or cancel the campaign before it begins? This is History Lab. History is not just the past, it is a laboratory for understanding the future.